Welcome to Office Hours with Ben, who I promised you a couple weeks ago, and then he and Christy switched, and we're back. And it's really Ben this time, which is fantastic. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, of course. It's great to be here. And sorry I couldn't make it. I think it was 2 weeks ago, but definitely glad to be back, I guess by popular demand. So,
Absolutely. Welcome to Office Hours. One sec. Sorry about that. That was me. Uh, just gonna mute that. Yeah. So I'm pulling up the chat to see what questions we might have. I know that you're working with a lot of our different enterprise clients at this point. Well, I should say that that's like a big part of your job, right? As a customer success solutions engineer, not success. Sorry. Hi, Amina. But I was wondering if you had any sort of like distilled wisdom you would want to share with the Raza community. Maybe somebody who's interested in starting an enterprise bot or who's just starting work on it, and is looking for you know, good guidance. What would you say to that person?
yeah, it's a great question. And I think just based on working with all these customers and their deployments and kind of going from that POC to enterprise stage, the most important piece is sort of um, setting up the infrastructure to do CDD, right? So really being able to ship models with like high agility, being able to ship models every week or 2 weeks, being able to iterate really quickly, and sort of like all the tooling around it, right? CI/CD, making sure you have annotators, making sure that you're running tests and all that. Because once that kind of flow gets going, it makes it just so much easier to deploy, fix, and kind of all that.
Yeah, so you mentioned CDD. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Because I think that's it is not our intention for it to be a Raza specific term, but I think Raza is the platform that is most wedded to it at the moment.
Yeah, so I guess conversation-driven development, and it's really the idea that when you're building your assistant and you're kind of trying to iterate on your intents and your data, that you should really be focused on capturing real user data.
Mm.
So not trying to focus on synthetic data. Building your models at least initially, having it fail often, testing, iterating, and kind of using that data to really improve your model on a frequent basis.
Okay, and hi Robbie. You also mentioned CI/CD, which I think is probably going to be familiar to the software engineers watching, but not everyone might have run into. So do you want to talk about that a little bit as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So CI/CD stands for continuous integration and continuous deployment. So it's the idea that you can build out like a pipeline or some kind of like tooling layer, right? So when you make updates to say your NLU data, you can have it automatically run tests, build your models, and kind of verify that your model is actually getting better as you add data to it, and kind of verify that things are working well in a very automated fashion. You can really ship things very easily without having to run manual tests and things like that.
Yeah, and I think it's especially important for machine learning projects to have both tests and also evaluation. Like, is our model suddenly performing very differently for some reason? Before you're just like, all right, we're just going to update it automatically, we're just going to push it out automatically, we're not going to check it, we're just going to believe that it works. Which I don't think people actually do that or think that that's a good idea, but that's sort of the opposite of the CI/CD approach.
Yeah, and I will say you'll kind of be surprised where a lot of people just assume that, oh, we can just manually test, right? We'll just go in
Mm,
and we'll just type some things, and then it doesn't really capture the full scope, and then that's
yeah.
kind of where things start to fall apart. So
Yeah, definitely. So do you want to talk about some types of tests that you might use specifically to make sure that you are capturing the full scope? And also, anyone has questions, please feel free to ask them, and I'll slip them in there.
yeah, absolutely. I would say for sure the first would be running your kind of end-to-end conversation tests.
Mhm.
So kind of in the way that in the command line when you run Rasa test and you have say a test folder and you have those example stories and that NLU data as well, and kind of making sure that those tests are built out from real conversations as well. So right, you collect user data, use that to iterate it, and you also kind of use that to test and verify that this flow or this path is working. That kind of tends to be the first, and then of course with NLU and machine learning, all your standard cross validation, F1 scores, all that good stuff definitely applies too. So.
Definitely. And something that was added to Raza X relatively recently was also the NLU Insights, I believe is what it's called, which sort of proactively identifies. You can set it to run at certain intervals. Be like, hey, this intent, we're getting this wrong a lot. Maybe check it out. Or hey, I've seen like a lot of different things in this. Your model's not entirely sure like what should go in it and what shouldn't. So maybe check it out and see if you can tighten up the training data a little bit or split it. So I think that also.
Yeah, 100%. And one thing I love about the NLU Insights thing that we shipped was that it gives you a place to click. For like this F1 is too low for this particular intent, and when you click on basically the recommendation, it'll actually open up the NLU inbox for you with that intent filtered, so you can just start annotating right away, and it's really great.
Amina has a question. Can we do the CI/CD with Git Lab? Oh, good question. I remember one of the office hour guests mentioned that there's a demo or an example, but I can't find it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So you can use GitLab, and I'm working with a couple customers who are deploying and managing all their code base in GitLab. I don't know if we have any examples in GitLab, just at least kind of on the Rasa side, but let me see if...
I'll pull this up. So I think what it might have been Greg who mentioned this, but there is on the GitLab blog a blog post about how to use Raza actions and Raza X on GitLab. So this might be the thing that you were mentioning it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is one other thing that, so we have in GitHub Actions, because that's kind of where we do a lot of our kind of dog fooding as far as CI/CD testing. We have some example pipelines that we can share if you just want to use that as a starting point. Let me see where I can just pop that link in for everyone.
If you send it to the Zoom, I can add it.
Okay, cool. Yes, I will put that in Zoom. Okay.
So this one you would use to build the GitLab equivalent.
Exactly. And it looks like kind of a lot of things happening, but kind of when you boil it down, it's really just kind of using the command line and running, Rasa test and Rasa train and kind of all that in a very kind of sequential fashion. But that's really all it's doing.
I hope that helps, Amina. And we also have a question from Ravi. How do you approach establishing business logic? Is there any trick you followed?
Oh, that's a great question. So I guess my response would be another question in that, do you have sort of a set of requirements or any sort of document that kind of models what's supposed to happen? Because that tends to be kind of where you build the requirement, the business logic from. So.
Yeah. I mean, it's on some level, building a conversational AI is just like any other software development project, right? There's going to be a lot of people who care about it. There's going to be a lot of people who like have different needs, and that could be including the people building it, the users, the people who are not using it but are going to be affected by it. So I would not say that you have to like come up with an entirely new process for conversational AI and chatbots. Thank gosh. I don't want to do that. So you can use a lot of the existing tools around project scoping and management to work on this type of project as well. And I feel like there was a blog post this morning about it, although it might have been. I'm just gonna pull that up real quick because I've been meaning to read it.
Is it Cooper's blog post?
It is Cooper's blog post.
Oh, I haven't read this either. Oh, this is
five
today.
Things. Yeah, I know, it's fresh, hot off the presses. 5 things teams should consider when building a virtual assistant. So I'll pop that up. Yeah, so this might also be a relevant blog post if you're starting to think about business logic and what matters when you're building an assistant. Yeah, so this is actually, it's on my to-do list to read this today because I really want to. But yeah, choose your use case with precision is point number 1, which that's so important. So important.
Yeah, I need to give this a read. It's great to hear about this stuff though. Yeah.
Cooper is a relatively new Raza, so I'm really excited to read this. This might be his first blog post. All right. Uh, Amina has a question. The response selector, from what I understood from the docs, is that it's useful if I have a lot of intents that can be answered in the same way. If I don't have this kind of behavior, I won't need the response selector.
Um, so I would say the response selector is actually, it's more useful for sort of when you have like a grouping of intents or a lot of intents that are all answered with kind of like a static text response. And kind of in that way, it using the response selector just makes it easier in that you don't have to create a story for every single intent, a story matching intent A to response A. You can just kind of match in the kind of a global sense, the retrieval intent to kind of the set of responses, and then it'll figure out all the mappings for you based on the naming. So that's, I guess, the intended use case in that sense.
Yeah. And you don't always need response selectors. From sort of the machine learning side, one thing that they're helpful with is that they can help you take a very large multi-class problem and turn it into a smaller multi-class problem, because there's actually a separate intent classification that runs right after the first intent classification. So you're nesting them a little bit. The downside to that is if you don't identify the overarching intent as being one of those intents that you do in this part of the classification, it don't work. So I wouldn't say that you always need a response selector. I would say that when you do need it, it should make your life easier and it should make your models more performant.
Yeah, 100%. That's funny. You brought that up about how it builds like a separate prediction graph. I actually didn't realize that until I started working with a customer who ran into memory issues because they were using too big of a response selector and was building out that graph. But
Um, Robbie says response selectors can handle simple conversations. Yeah. Um, and it's sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not. It really just depends on your use case, which I don't know, I feel like it depends is the the weaselly technical answer. It's true, it depends. So we're waiting for, oh, let me double check this chat. Hello Mad Rage. While we're waiting for more questions to come in, I'm wondering if there's anything that you run into that you would recommend people avoid in terms of testing or deployment or DevOps. Just sort of like common patterns that like on the first look they're like, oh, that seems really reasonable, I should do that. And then like once you get deeper into it and the system gets bigger and more complex, it turns out that maybe it wasn't the best idea.
yes, great question. And I would say, well, at least what comes to mind right now is sort of when you think about CI/CD and you start building out your models and your bot starts obviously getting bigger, a lot more training data. Thinking about where you're training your models, and I think one thing that a lot of people will assume is in Rasa X, oh, we have this kind of API, we have a button to train, we can train it there, and that actually tends to be sort of an anti-pattern in a sense, because it's all shared resources when you deploy Rasa X in terms of training and reviewing conversations and all that. So in that sense, when you're building out your CI pipeline, definitely carefully consider where you're training your models. Think about whether you need a GPU, right? Training on a GPU will give you a lot lower train times, but you do have to set up all the infrastructure for that as well. For have your CI reach out to that server and kind of run that. But yeah, definitely as far as training, definitely thinking carefully about where that's happening and if you need it to run at a certain speed, not running it on say a small VM on the CI runner since that can be pretty slow.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I had not thought of that before, but I will keep that in mind. But I think for prototyping at least, training with the button should be a good quick way to do it.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, for your kind of smaller bots, definitely no issues. Just as working with other enterprises and they're building out close to 100 intents with a lot of annual data. Yeah, it definitely gets pretty crazy.
That's a big bot. All right, and we have questions. It saves lots of typing. Oh, the response selectors. Yes, definitely true. Um, Amina says, Ben, do you use Raza tests with your customers, and can you explain exactly how, please? How do you explain the results in the results file to non-tech people?
Yes, another great question. So I definitely do recommend using Rasa test, and all the customers I work with The developers will use Rasa test when just kind of doing local building and things like that, but also in their CI pipelines. There are, pretty much all the customers that I'm working with who are kind of deploying to production are also using that command line in their CI, to validate, run against conversation tests, and things like that. And there was a second part to that question that I think I just forgot.
How do you explain the results to non-technical people? So I think we talked about this previously with the evaluation, but you'll get a results file that has like all the things that a machine learning engineer would want to know about, and maybe that's not always the things that everyone wants to know about, as it turns out.
Yeah, I would say it'll create in the results folder when you run Rasa tests, right? Like the failed test stories point out to you your scores, and kind of all that. And I would say, at least kind of thinking about your kind of non-machine learning personas, if you will. A lot of it is setting up your CI pipeline in a way that, if someone tries to push something and it fails a test, maybe throwing an error or throwing like a failed check, just so they know that, okay, something went wrong, and then kind of digging deeper or maybe reaching out to someone specific for that is a good way to go about it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good stance, because not everyone needs to have a deep understanding of machine learning on the project and these sort of evaluation metrics. That's really sort of specialist knowledge, and even if you do have a good understanding of all the metrics, it's not necessarily clear what to change in the model to make those numbers change. I mean, even one of the frustrating things about machine learning is we don't have like a good principled overarching understanding of how different models work. And what I mean by that is, if I want my model to change in this way, I can give you general suggestions, but I can't tell you before you retrain the model exactly what change is going to have what effect on the model, which I don't think is necessarily obvious to people who don't have a lot of machine learning background, and is just not, like, that's the state of the field, right? So if you look at machine learning papers, it'll be like people trying a bunch of stuff and being like, here's what happened. And it's pretty rare for machine learning paper to be like, all right, here are the theoretical limits of X, and we've got a lot of proofs to show it, and if you do X, Y will always happen. I've seen maybe 4 or 5 papers like that specifically for deep learning, total in my career, and I try to seek them out because that's it's good knowledge to know. But yeah, so it sounds like you would recommend sort of very general understanding, and then being like, okay, and now here's who you talk to about this if something goes wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you brought up a great point about the sort of determinate or non-deterministic nature of machine learning, because I run into that, working with customers all the time, where and I have to explain to some of these software engineers that these test stories are training examples, right? Just because you build the story doesn't mean it will work 100% of the time every time with that one story.
Yeah, and it's I think it can be very disquieting, especially for like really experienced software engineers. If your evaluation is 100%, something's wrong. Like, you want to have a certain degree of error. Otherwise, it's almost positive. It's almost certain that you're overfitting to your training data, and your model's not going to be able to extend very well and generalize very well. And it is it's a very different way of treating the ways that computers interact with data and people. And yeah, it's just different, right? All right, and we've got a question from Mario Matzula. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. I'm not entirely sure where the boundaries in that word are. I'm currently trying to set up a custom channel in a container. My problem is, what must the correct name of the additional channel credentials YAML values.yaml be?
Okay. Wait, did you say values.yaml or?
In values.yaml, the correct name for the additional channel credentials.
Okay. Yeah, so what it has to be, and I run into this all the time, is you have to point it to the relative path of that of the channel custom channel file. So the values.yaml is this person is probably deploying with the Helm chart with Rasa X, and basically in that file, underneath I think Rasa, or either Rasa or Rasa production, you define the credentials. So there's sort of two things that you need to do. So either, I mean, you would need to include your custom channel as part of the image. So building your own Docker image, deploying that way, and kind of making it available to the container that in that sense, or mounting it as a volume. And then in terms of the credentials file and defining, that connector, it's a relative path. So the way that Python does it is, if you have, say your channel file is like channel.py and it's inside a folder called connectors, you do connectors dot channel dot the class name and then colon, and then that would work.
I don't think
And I
this is
think
the right place in the docs to point someone to.
if you go to the Rasa open source docs, we have some stuff on like custom channels. If you scroll down, channel connectors, and then custom connectors. And yeah, exactly. So, and then if you scroll, there we go. Yeah. Yeah. So it's just kind of that Python module path that you have to.
Yeah, hope that helps, Mario. And I love your coding sessions, Rachel. Oh, thank you. I feel like just background for you, Ben, I've been working with Docker Compose, and I would say that Docker is not my strongest area as a developer. It's been a tiny bit of a struggle bus, so thank you, Mario. I'm glad they're helpful. Yeah, Amina says, thank you, really helpful. Oh, I'm glad we could help. Can you use, this is from Amina, fallback without an out of scope intent? I had both, and the assistant always goes to out of scope instead of the fallback.
So yes, but as far as sort of what we recommend, it definitely would be best practice to use an out of scope intent. And I think part of it kind of goes back to what we were talking about as far as the non-deterministic nature of kind of NLU, and you don't want to rely on the confidence score to show a message versus not. So definitely, I would say creating an out of scope intent and kind of relying on that would be a good
Yeah. So in our docs, in the fallback section, the first thing that we recommend is an out of scope intent. Yeah, and I think this a good sort of way to think about why this would be helpful is when you're responding to an out of scope intent, you know that someone has asked for something that your assistant can't do, right? And so given that, you can be like, okay, this person doesn't have a good understanding of what my assistant's capable of. This is a great time to tell them, right? So it's a good place to maybe add some examples or even some buttons for maybe your most commonly used sort of things that your assistant can do to help get people back on the right track. Whereas with the fallback policy, it's not, I know what you've asked for and it's something I can't do. It's more, I'm not really sure what you're asking for. I don't have high confidence. The thing that you've asked for is not like any of the other training data that I've seen before. I don't really know what to do. So in that case, it's not as clear what to do with the, like how to help the user to use your assistant better. And usually people like, we'll use something like, could you rephrase that? I didn't understand. And if you get that a lot, that's not a great user experience. So if people are asking out of scope things and they're hitting the out of scope intent, I would say that that's a good thing, right? Because then you can help them and you can help them use the assistant in a way that's more helpful. Or, I mean, send them to a person. So we also have a section in here in human handoff. And if this conversational assistant is part of a system that also humans can answer questions, if people are running into like the out of scope intent a lot or the fallback intent a lot, then I would default to kicking them out to humans as soon as possible, just so you don't get like really angry users who are having a bad time and finding it not very helpful. I know, that's my stance.
Yeah, and I would say what I see a lot is building out your out of scope intent and kind of like beefing that up so it's a little more confident as far as predicting that. And then a lot of times customers will use that to kind of drive on what features do we want to build on now, right? Looking at that data that's coming in out of scope and using.
Yeah, definitely. What intents to add, what functionality to add, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, adding more data and more examples, particularly examples from users, will also should help with that. Yeah, Ben's definitely right there. And it looks like we don't have any outstanding questions right now. Oh, we got one. Mario says, thanks, Ben. I'm receiving fail to find input channel class for add-ons, Jabber channel. What am I missing?
Failed to find. Oh, are you importing the input channel class from the Rasa library? Let me find you the link, because you have to make sure that when you build your custom channel, that all the sort of necessary libraries are being imported in the same way that they are in our underlying code base.
And while you're doing that, I see me ask some questions, but I've got a quick one for Nick. Do you have any human handoff scenarios or examples to share? Yes, one of our Raza assistants, the help desk assistant, has a little. It's kind of fake because we don't actually have like a human sitting around in case somebody wants to use this example. But it does have an example of how you do that in the code by handing off between two assistants. So you can modify that to instead be handing it off to a human assistant. So I will share that link right now because I think that's the best place to go for more information. Ben's getting that link for Mario.
Oh yeah, I just popped that into the Zoom chat.
Let me share that. You can watch us figure out links. All right, and that's the right one. Channel classes. All right, and that should be shared. Amina has another question. I have a form with 4 slots. Everything is filled well when I just run Raza debug. I can see for my slots, which are all entities, and they're being linked to the out of scope instead of the correct intent. And how can I fix this? In the NLU file, I did specify entities for each intent. Should I mention this in the domain file in the form part? I mean, I guess my first question is, in the short term, is this a problem? Like, does it matter what intent you get while filling out the form? In the long term, having your out of scope intent include things that are in scope will be a problem.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking whether you have like an inform intent or something defined like that to sort of capture, very, at least just in the context of that active form, kind of short-term answers or short responses that the user might be giving to fill in that information.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a good example of that would be in MoodBot. So let me pull that up real quick. We use MoodBot has an inform intent, and all of the data, NLU, pop this over, pop this up. Yeah, there we go. So a good example of what that might look like is in, oh, nope, it doesn't have an inform intent. I was 100% wrong about that. It's got mood great and mood unhappy.
I think the financial demo, the financial demo will have one. Yeah, that should be it.
I think I have modified MoodBot in my personal examples to have that previously, and that's a different thing. All right, let's pop this up.
Yeah, we'll say MoodBot is my go-to when I'm testing anything, like testing this. I'll just open up MoodBot.
Absolutely. NLU, YAML, scroll, check human, affirm, transfer change, check earnings. We're gonna get there. There we go, inform. Okay. Sure. So this has just a bunch of different examples when people are sharing a single piece of information. So things like this would actually be picked up by Duckling. And then these things are entities that are being trained as, I think, financial demo uses diet by default. So these things are being trained to be recognized by diet. And it's just like, anytime somebody is sharing a piece of information, it should be, and that's the only thing they're doing in the turn, it should be picked up as this inform intent. And I believe all of these are, being used in forms. Or rather, I believe forms are using this inform intent for when people are sharing pieces of information. It's hard to express well.
Yeah, forms and inform, it's a little too close, right?
Wow. But yeah, I would add more examples to your out of scope intent that are things that are out of scope, and then I would add more and I would create, if you don't have one, an inform intent, and then just put a bunch of like what people would say to the form in the inform intent, and see if you can use that to peel those things apart. Mario says the file is not found. Import error, cannot retrieve class from path.
Do you know what version of Rasa you're on? Because that will make a difference as well.
And it'll be a little bit before we get response, just because of the delay between us and the chat. So while we're waiting for that, and it might be, if you haven't asked on the forums already, Mario, it might be a good idea to ask on the forums. Where's my animation? There's my animation. It's forum.raza.com. So we can get a little bit more information. You can share some of your code example as well. I think that might be helpful in this situation. Yeah, I mean, it says it's not a problem for now. Yeah, so I would take the work on the inform intent and work on the out of scope intent training data a little bit, and then see how it goes. Robbie says, can you explain to me about webhooks? Yeah, Ben, can you explain to us about webhooks?
I guess webhooks in the sense of like our channel connectors, or webhooks in a different sense.
I'm assuming related to our channel connectors. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So webhooks is essentially the endpoint that Rasa or the Rasa server exposes to kind of hit all the channel connectors. And I guess, I mean, beyond that, we'd have to get into like the underlying mechanism of how like REST and socket calls work, which we can get into, but I'm not sure if that's what you're asking for. So
my understanding of it, and I would say networking is also another area where I am actively learning, let's put it that way, is that basically it's like a specialized URL that takes specific types of, that you can do specific things at, and those things that you can do are defined by the program that is accepting the information, or not, depending on what it's doing. How's that as a very
yeah, essentially there's like types of requests you can make, like get, put, post, and based on the type of call you make is based on what you're trying to do. Like if you're doing a health check, then it's a get request. If you're trying to say hit a channel connector and you need to pass some data, it'll be a post. And then it'll return like a status code saying, I accepted that 200, or I have no idea what you're talking about. This webhook doesn't work, probably 400. And then optionally a response, or a payload response as well. But that would be for HTTP requests. And this is getting, so like for sockets, it's totally different because you need to like, I guess, I don't know how much people know what networking, but like, UDP versus TCP. So that's like your datagrams, which is like your individual packets. So you can think of it as like someone wants to send you bread, they'll send you a bunch of breadcrumbs and then you put it together. And that's like UDP. And then TCP is like a phone line. So keeping the connection like active and static. And then that's like an open lane, if you will. And that's like passing data back and forth, which is what sockets would be. So.
Interesting. That is helpful. And a little additional clarification, I do see some other questions, but Robbie was specifically asking about REST.
Okay. Yes. So with REST, it's really just submitting a post request to the webhooks /REST/webhook. Of course, you need to make sure in your credentials file you have the REST channel activated, but it's really just making a post request to that webhook. And then in terms of the payload that's expected, you just have a sender ID and a message in a JSON object. You make that post request, make sure that your load balancer, whatever networking infrastructure is set up to kind of accept that. And then you'll get a JSON request back, or JSON payload back with the bot's response. And that's kind of how you interact with the bot, with any front end that you might build.
Yeah, I hope that helps. Also, Buena Polly had a question that I am getting to now out of order. Sorry about that. Does Raza have analytics inbuilt?
Yes. So in Rasa X, we do have sort of like an analytics page that gives you some high level metrics, as far as number of users and sort of some basic information like that. But I will say, if you're deploying, at scale, at an enterprise level, at production, the sort of recommendation is if you have an analytics tool, Prometheus, Grafana, even New Relic, to kind of use what you have existing, since Rasa can kind of plug and play quite nicely using the event broker. So if you look into that, that's probably the way to go about
it. Yeah, hopefully that helps. Nick wants to know any scenario on how to use conversation data logs to create analytic dashboards. Oh, very similar. For example, user questions, confidence scores, timestamp, etc., so I can monitor out of scope questions.
Yeah, so that kind of goes back to using the event broker in the sense that when you set up your Rasa open source server, all the data that's going to your tracker store, so all the conversation data is also being streamed to the event broker. So if you're using either RabbitMQ or Kafka, all the events that get saved will get streamed to there as well. And then kind of the typical workflow is setting up your data lake or kind of any kind of, I guess, analytics system to kind of ingest those events. And then inside those events, you'll have the confidence scores, you'll have all that information, and you can build your dashboards to parse them.
And I would say the specific things that somebody cares about for a specific chatbot are going to be, in general, pretty unique. So there's not a lot of like pre-built tools that we offer because most people have like, no, I know exactly what I need, and I'm going to get my data scientist to build it.
Yeah, 100%. It pretty much is always bespoke to the customer, and kind of we got to work through it specifically.
Aditya, sorry if I'm saying that wrong, says, does Raza have some time limit on giving responses? Because in my project, sometimes when I make a delay in sending a message to a Raza chatbot, then the chatbot just won't respond to me. Can you help? Also, hello.
Hi. So in the sense, I guess that the bot needs to do some kind of processing in the backend before supplying the response back to the user, and whether there's a limit there. I think that's the question. So there is, and that's something you can actually change in the underlying source, since there's open source. But let me just find what that timeout is. Let's see.
And I will say, there's like the Raza internal stuff, and also some channels have their own things. Like I know people have had, in particular, I've heard a lot of users talking about Facebook Messenger and having trouble with like trying to have a delay in the conversation. So that's, I don't know, that may or may not be slightly related to your question. But yes, there is internal stuff in Raza.
Yeah, actually, you're bringing up a good point. Yeah, it is channel specific now that I think about it a little more, because if you use something like the callback channel, you won't run into the sort of the same inherent limits that, say, using REST would, since the callback lets the bot make or send the response to a different endpoint that you specify, so it kind of allows you to separate that out. So still looking.
Oh, and another thing that you can set on a project-specific basis is like whether or not and how long to wait before the conversation resets. So like if I am talking to my chatbot, and then I go to make a cup of coffee and then I come back, depending on like what's been set for the project, I might have to like restart a conversation over from scratch, or it may just remember me. And you can say like, oh, I want you to remember like signed in people, but not these other people. So Raza is very configurable, I would say, if I had to describe it.
Yeah, So I just popped the link into the Zoom chat, Rachel.
Sure
And basically the timeout, as far as the request timeout, is set by default to 5 minutes. So I guess I'm not sure if in this case you're waiting longer than that or less, or in that case it's probably tied to the channel connector that you use.
I hope that helps. Amina wants to know, I tried to use buttons, but I faced some issues. I tried exactly in the docs, but I didn't succeed. Can you give me an example that you guys tried with Raza 2, please? Ooh, a Raza 2 assistant with buttons.
I know we have some button bot examples, but let me see if I can find something that would be helpful.
Another thing to know about buttons, like with images, is, you know, Raza will provide like the information to, like, here's where the image is, right? Like the URL, and whether or not the image is actually rendered in the little chat widget or whatever you're talking to is going to depend on specifically, you know, it's going to be channel specific. I feel like that's the theme of this office hours. So you may need to do like additional stuff to show an image on the specific channel that you're using, or to get the buttons to render correctly in the channel that you're using. And that'll depend.
Yeah, it depends. But I just put a link in the Zoom chat with an example of some button responses in our help desk assistant.
Button responses example. And then Aditya says, thank you. Oh, you're very welcome. I hope it helped. All right. Nick asks how to create the index using the event broker. The issue is that the data type in Postgres is text and conversation logs data is in JSON format. How can we read the data? Text payload to confidence, etc., etc.
Yes. So basically, you'll have to cast it as a JSON and then use that to parse. And I guess I'm not entirely sure what your kind of dev stack looks like, but that could be either directly in sort of whatever tooling that ingests it, or as a microservice. So it kind of depends. But yeah, you will have to basically parse that as a JSON object and then kind of do some sort of data manipulation there.
All right. Anirudh says, I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong. Can we use checkboxes while giving options, since I want to select multiple options? Oh, interesting.
So you can in Slack, and I know that you can, but the way you go about it is, I feel like we're going back to the channel specific thing again. But you'd probably have to use a custom response payload, and then depending on how your front end parses it, do it in that way, and also most likely create like some sort of custom channel connector, so it understands, you know, giving this sort of checklist, what should I give back to the bot to understand it.
Yeah, and I would, just thinking about it from the conversation standpoint, and how this could make it very difficult to maintain your assistant, I would probably use checkboxes for things like entities, and I probably wouldn't use them for things like intents. You could, it will be complex, and I'd have to say that the payoff from having people be able to respond multiple intents simultaneously and you being able to handle them well, would have to be, at least for me, it would have to be amazing. Like, it would have to, like, you know, make my assistant 5 times as successful for me to want to put in the work to maintain that, because that get complex. Yeah, but like returning multiple entities, I think that's a good use for checkboxes.
Yeah, definitely. And I think to that point, one thing is that I definitely see a lot of times, you know, people or developers sort of assuming that let's create a new intent for something that should be an entity. So kind of in that line, definitely, yeah, using entities is always a good idea when you can.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is where I think if you are lucky enough to have a conversation designer or a UX person on your team, they can really help you, you know, talk through those things and like provide guidelines. Okay, like when should something be an intent specifically for our assistant? Like, can we have like, a certain threshold of people asking for a specific thing that we can't handle with entities. So that could be a great time to work with other team members. Assuming it's not just you. Hello, Habib and Sabir. Welcome to the stream. Amina asks, the tracker store will store the user conversation, but it's mentioned in the docs that if you restart the Raza server, the entire history will be lost. To avoid this, should I use another tracker, not the default one?
Yes. So by default, the tracker store that gets stood up is in memory. So like you kind of just alluded to, right? If the server crashes or it has to restart, all the data gets clear. So definitely, if you're thinking about deploying your assistant in kind of any sense to any users, definitely setting up like a separate tracker store database, whether it be in Postgres or MongoDB or the other supported types, and doing that would be definitely a good idea.
I mean, also just like if you do have a bunch of analytic stuff on top of it, you don't necessarily want to be like making queries in your prod database. Ask me what experiences I've had with that. Bad ones. I learned a lot. Severe says, do we have an example for setting up an external Postgres database as a tracker store in a Raza X Docker Compose setup? Oh, that's specific.
I believe the default Docker Compose setup will use Postgres as the tracker store. Let me see if that's in our Rasa X documentation. I think it is, but let me double check. Yes. So if you go to, and you scroll down to the endpoints.yaml file, that would be underneath configure. Yeah. And you scroll down a little bit.
Endpoints.
Okay, there we go. Perfect. Yeah, so right there, tracker store Postgres.
Yeah. It's in the docs. Yay, that one was nice and easy. I miss. And Nick says, to Amina, buttons, examples using payloads and everything depends on the front end, and suggest checking out Raza web chat. Yeah, like anything that like isn't just text basically is going to be front end dependent what it looks like. Annie Root says, very informational, thank you. Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad you liked it. And Aditya says, if the chatbot does not respond, then is it because I have not provided enough data for intent classification? Like I have to provide more sentences which then have the same intent for classification. Not responding.
Yeah, so not responding, I think, could be a lot of different things. I would say if you could run like Rasa shell with the debug flag, that would kind of help you know. It could be NLU, it could be the dialog manager, it could be something else.
I can never remember how to get to the CLI in the docs, but I think I have to type it out. I think I can't just say CLI. Yeah, so shell. And then specifically this one, Raza shell --debug will print a lot of information, but it will be very helpful. And if you are comfortable with it, you can also ask on the forums as well. And we're like, to answer the question on the forum, we would also need more information, like what's happening. Yeah, if your response relies on an action server, sometimes it can be like the action server isn't running. That has happened to me. That's what we were working on in the live coding recently. Yeah, could be a lot of stuff. Amina says, the Raza architecture overview, there's a component called lock store, which is a ticket lock mechanism. Can you help me understand more, please? What is the use? Let me pull this up. We can look at the architecture.
Yes, that is a great question. And it really comes into play when you're kind of deploying at scale and you have multiple Rasa open source containers running at once, say in like a replicated environment. And then in that sense, the lock store makes sure that for a given kind of user message or conversation, that only one Rasa open source node is processing the message at any given time. So it'll say, I got this message from the user. I'm going to lock while I'm processing and trying to get what's supposed to happen next. And then the second I give that response to the user, I'll unlock, and then any kind of other container might be free to process the subsequent messages.
The way that I remember, which is, I don't know, maybe it's a little silly way, is like you're getting like a hotel room key and nobody else can get into your hotel room, but you can get into your hotel room, and then when you're done, you give the key back, and then somebody else can take the key and go into the hotel room, but one person at a time has the key. That's my mnemonic. It may or may not help you.
It's actually a great description. Yeah, the key is
and Adita and Ravi says, Adita says thank you, and Ravi says, same question, I'm guessing as Nick. Any video or example of CI/CD deployment or any tutorials? Can you briefly give an idea of what it looks like?
I believe in our docs page.
Yeah.
I think we have some, but I would definitely take a look at our example CI/CD pipeline in GitHub Actions, because that is always, I guess, my go-to starting point as far as how to build that out. So
we do have, here it is. I looked for it in another window. Under building assistance preparing for production, we do have a little walkthrough. Oh, and there's a link to the Git Lab one as well, which I think Amina was asking about that. And then, is this just going to be the GitHub Action link? Let's find out. Yeah. No, this is just about GitHub Actions. We do have a sample GitHub Action. Let me see if I can find it real quick.
It might be in that same page. Let me see.
We have a blog post. I think that's probably going to be maybe the most helpful resource. And I'll share the link to this as well. Yeah, I don't think we have. I'm trying to remember if we have any specific videos up about it that would be relevant. I don't think we have. There might be some in the tutorial series. But like what your specific pipeline is going to look like is going to be pretty dependent on your setup. So it's a little bit hard to do video content that can show you what it's going to look like exactly for you, just because there's so much variation in what people are using to deploy. Yeah. I don't know if you have anything else you wanna add.
Yeah, I mean, it's super, I guess, dependent on what your infrastructure looks like, but I guess that the sort of gist of it is you'll be doing some kind of Rasa data validate, Rasa train, and then Rasa test, kind of using those command line tools. But sort of the way you go about it is going to be pretty dependent on your use case. So.
And like even in the docs, you can see that we have like the GitHub one, the GitLab one, the Jenkins one. So there's a lot of variation. Yeah, but hopefully it helped, and will help you find more resources for your specific use case. Ravi wants to know, is CI/CD necessary when you're building a chatbot for enterprise, or do you need it for personal projects? Like, when would you recommend using CI/CD?
Yeah, so I would say for enterprise projects and anything that you're deploying at an enterprise level, it's pretty much a must, and you're going to need that before you hit production, kind of guaranteed. For personal projects, I would say it's not as important, and it's really just dependent on whether you want to or not, but definitely not as critical in that.
I would say if your personal project is specifically something for your portfolio that you're building to help you get a job, then yes, I would do it. If it's just like a fun thing that you're building for yourself to solve a problem that you have, then I think it's less important. Would be my personal litmus test. And Aditya says, does the tracker store help me to extract answers to a specific query and then help me to store those answers in a Firebase database, or does it have some other usage?
So the tracker store is not really meant for kind of any sort of like, I guess, processing in the sense of like understanding the user message. It's mostly for kind of like long-term storage, if you will, of like what happened in this conversation, or maybe something went wrong in the server. I need to go back and kind of double check at what point in the conversation something broke. Because basically with the way that Rasa works, it'll kind of process everything. It'll understand the message, process the intent, try to figure out the response, and then send that response back to the user. And then kind of in addition to that, as like a separate process, if you will, kind of store all the things that it said back to the user and things that the user said in that database. So it's kind of a separate sort of storage piece.
Yeah, I hope that helps. Because yeah, it's not. I hope that helps clarify. Sorry, my light went out and I'm very distracted. It's fine. The battery's just ran out. Oh yeah. Last week Akila mentioned the IVR demo. Do you have any idea if it's shared out or is it still too early? I will say,
Demo.
I haven't seen it shared out yet. So if it is, it has been done very sneakily, which is not usually the way that we share demos. So I would say TBD.
Yeah, okay, so we haven't put out anything, I guess, publicly. But I will say a Twilio IVR demo is definitely in the works, so stay tuned. Yeah.
Yeah. It just says it saves the conversation in the database, and you can use SQL queries to fetch questions and export it to CSV or Excel or whatever you want to do to use it. Yeah. Koiba, I'm sorry if I'm saying y'all's names wrong. Can Razzidocker be deployed in Kubernetes cluster with multiple replicas?
Yes. And typically you would use our Helm chart if you're deploying to Kubernetes. And there's actually in the values.yaml file, you can actually configure the number of replicas you want deployed to your Rasa production or Rasa open source nodes. So yes, definitely refer to our Helm chart installation, as you can see here.
And this is in the Raza X docs. Yeah. Robbie says, thank you, Rachel and Ben. You're very welcome. Nick says, can we create a complete CI/CD using Docker Compose?
Docker Compose. So technically, yes, as long as, say, if you set up your CI/CD pipeline in a Docker container or an image, and then you run it in that sense and have it sort of sync with your version control, whether it be GitHub or Git Lab, that would work. But I think, like a lot of answers we've given, it depends. And I'm not sure if there are certain cases when using a Docker image to set up your CI/CD pipeline might be a good idea, but in a lot of cases it might be a little sort of too complex. So just thinking about a simpler way to deploy might be a better use case. But yeah, I guess it depends.
Yeah, and what I have learned in the past couple of weeks from talking to the CSE team is that in general Helm is going to be easier. So if you have the option to use that, do that. I'm kind of thinking of going back and redeploying my my live coding project with Helm. Yeah. All right. So we've got just about a minute to wrap up. Amina says, thank you. I always enjoy the office hours. Really helpful. I always enjoy having you, Amina. Thank you for your really good questions. Adita says, thank you, Nick and the Raza guys. You're very welcome. Happy to help. And Nick was saying, no worries to Adita. Fantastic. All right. So we've got 1 minute. I don't want to keep you too late, but is there any last thing you would like the Raza community to know or keep in mind, or just like a cool thing you want to share?
Well, I guess this is just some food for thought, and Rachel can, I'm sure, continue this discussion if questions come up. But I think one of the things that I do see a lot with sort of, Rasa being kind of gaining in popularity and a lot of developers getting exposed to it is sort of thinking about when you should even use machine learning to solve a problem. I think
Mm,
that is a lot of times some confusion, right? Thinking about, oh, should we just use machine learning, or can you use regex or rule-based sort of components if you need that deterministic behavior? And that's always an interesting sort of discussion that I have with customers and engineers. So
yeah, definitely. It's good to have in the back of mind, right? You've got a bunch of tools. Are you using the appropriate one, or are you using the fancy one because you want to play with the fancy tool? I get it. I do that, but maybe not necessarily going to be the best for you long term as you work on a maintainer project.
yeah, 100%. I think also with Rasa open source, it's not like you're tied to one. You can use a combination, and that
Absolutely.
is always great too. So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Ben. Thank you all so much for watching. We'll be back tomorrow with the reading group. I'm really excited about this paper. It's so the paper is a scoping paper about using chatbots in museums to like help people interact with and learn more about art. And they do have a chatbot up. It is in German, so I don't know like how much we're gonna be able to talk about what it is and how it works. But yeah, I'm really interested to think about sort of new use cases and what might be good and what might be you know, more challenging in that particular use case. So we will be back tomorrow for that, and also tomorrow morning at 8, so an hour before the usual stream time. And that's not going to be on YouTube. It'll be uploaded to YouTube later, but if you want to sign up, head to our YouTube community channel. We have our Beyond the Release note, so it's going to be live. There'll be a Q&A section about sort of the latest changes to Raza, so check that out. And again, that's the link for that is in the YouTube community tab if you want to sign up. All right. Thanks so much for joining today, everybody, and I'll see you tomorrow. And thank you for joining Ben.